Hey everyone, patch 3.21 Crucibles here, and I wanted to do a quick TLDR of all of the changes, all of the things that are coming, and of the patch notes for the people who haven't read them but are interested in the changes or want to hear my opinions on everything. So why don't we get started and quickly just go through everything and then go through the patch notes. So with Crucible, what this is going to do is it's going to add a pillar that you can click on in your areas. And the more that you channel into it, the more difficult the monsters and the more monsters that you will spawn out of said pillar. Once you complete your encounter that you scaled up to your personal difficulty, you will be granted the ability to add a passive tree to your weapon, and you'll also gain experience. As you can see, each tree will have its own distinct layout and it'll have its own distinct nodes, with the closer nodes being weaker and then the further nodes being stronger and stronger and stronger. Now, they have not said if you can respec these trees, but I believe you will not be able to, so every choice will be permanent, and every single weapon in the game will have its own unique tree. This means if you have two of the identical same weapon, unless they are mirrored, they will not have the same tree, they will have completely separate trees. Some of the effects at the end can be ridiculously powerful, and some of the things that they have shown off so far seem to be very bonkers. A good example of this is some of the endgame nodes completely change how some skills work. So for example, this one gives you 50% chance to get Soul Eater for 20 seconds when you kill a rare or unique with double strike and dual strike. This might make those builds viable, while in some cases might completely change the way you look at a build. So for example, Flicker Strike and Village Strike's cooldown can be bypassed by power charges instead of frenzy or endurance charges. So this makes you want to go a power charge stacking frenzy build. There's a lot of really insane stuff like this. You can also see things such as in socketed gems. One example that they have shown was that you can get Empower on a wand, which begs the question that maybe that means you can get a Enlighten on a shield or an Enlighten on different weapons, giving you a free Enlighten in your skills, as well as just a multitude of just raw additional stats, such as this one giving raw crit chance. This is a pretty exciting system, and as you do maps, you will be able to find remnants, and these will allow you to access a new zone, which will have monsters, and once you kill all the monsters inside of these zones, you will get some sort of reward based on what your remnant says. Some examples of what they have shown off is the ability to recombinate two weapons together. And what this will do is it will mush the two passive trees together. So if you have two really insane passive trees, you could potentially make an even more disgusting passive tree. Some other examples as well of all this is the ability to put these on unique items. Unique items do not inherently come with a passive tree, but you will be able to, through some special cores, to come in here and put a passive tree on a unique weapon, making unique weapons potentially extremely powerful once again. This system also applies to shields. So shields will have their own unique defensive oriented nodes. They have not really shown many of these off, so we can't really speculate too much, but I believe that you might find some really interesting thing on shields as well. This season is all about making your weapons and your shields substantially stronger, and there should be a lot of power in what you can do here. Let's go over the patch notes, and I will try to TLDR everything in here as fast as I can for you so you can move on with your day. The first big changes is they are adding a few new support gems to the game. These are actually pretty exciting. First, we are getting Snipe, which you might know from the Helmet Asylum, which is a Delirium unique item. Snipe allows you to charge a skill and then release it for substantially more damage. This was very popular with Puncture, and back in the day, we used to have 5-link Puncture builds that did pretty well. Well, now you can have a 6-link Snipe, and you can play this with anything you want, and you don't have to rely on the helmet. There's a new Dex Intelligence gem called Manaforge Arrows. This effectively is cast a bow ability on a bow attack, as long as you've paid enough mana. This might allow you to automate some things in your build, such as potentially a bow attack that has a curse on hit on it that has another curse. This might give you a way to do that, but this gives you a lot of options to either potentially automate your build or to potentially have some sort of bow on bow type build. Lastly, you have Prismatic Burst, and the big TLDR here is you are going to do discharges around you when you attack with attacks. And those discharges will either do cold, lightning, or fire, and they are going to be changed based on how much of a stat you have. So for example, the more intelligence you have, the more likely you'll choose lightning. This looks to be some sort of stat stacking build, which might actually be really interesting if the numbers are good on this. Lastly, they are removing Onslaught from the game and adding Momentum. They haven't said what Momentum does, but it seems to be Onslaught in the sense of you gain attack speed and cast speed, but you have to be stationary and you lose it when you move. We are also getting some new ball skills. They have shown some of these off, and some of them look absolutely amazing. Ball Absolution summons a massive Absolution minion that just does massive AoEs and does basically as much damage as your other Absolutions put together. Ball Animated Weapon just raises a bunch of random unique weapons. So you're going to be kind of spinning the wheel and kind of gambling every time you press it, see how much power you get out of this. Vol Arctic Armor, if you play World of Warcraft, is an ice block. You're going to be able to press Vol Arctic Armor. You're going to be frozen, but you gain 90% DR for a few seconds, allowing you to potentially cheese abilities. They have not shown what Vol Dominion is. Vol Firestorm looks to be some sort of ability where giant meteors come down and then encircle your enemy and then collide. Ball Ice Shot seems to be a bunch of mirages spawn of you and also shoot Ice Shot when you attack with Ice Shot. Ball Lightning Arrow is going to be some sort of ability where you summon a bunch of lightning arrows that randomly move and teleport around every time you attack, allowing for some really insane shotgunning. This alone might make Vol Lightning Arrow insane this season. Vol Lightning Arrow is already good, but it needed some help here and there. This should more than make up for all of the issues Vol Lightning Arrow has, and this should make this build as good as Caustic Arrow, to where Caustic Arrow is now a standalone build where the Vol ability is a massive single target damage increase. Vol Reap also looks insane. They're just straight up buffing Reap. This makes your charges go up, and it basically gives you 20% more damage while this is active. They have not shown what Vol Rejuvenation Totem is, but it's going to be interesting to see what they do with that. Moving on, they are reworking how Breach and how Abyss works. My personal take on all this is they are wanting you to not necessarily be farming Breach for all of the special items that you get out of it. For example, they're nerfing how many uniques that you get from Breach, and they're nerfing how you're acquiring blessings. And what they're trying to make you do is they're trying to actually make you do breach stones, which this might actually make breach stones a very viable way of making money. They have removed every single tier of breach stone that isn't flawless or normal, and a blessing will immediately upgrade a normal breach stone to a flawless breach stone. With all this, they're also upping the monster level of all the areas, with Shayula now being level 83. This should make flawless breach stones really worth your time to run, or maybe a potentially alternative way to gaining XP other than 5-way running. They're also nerfing Flash Breach, but they are baking most of it into breaches by default. So your breaches will be really fast now, and you can make it a slight bit faster if you really want to by picking up the nerfed version of Flash Breach. The other portion of this is the amount of bosses they're going to spawn is going to be lowered. The amount of blessings and items they're going to be dropping is lowered. But overall, your splinters are going to go up. So they're going to make you want to pick up splinters, and they're going to make you want to actually run the breach zones. They have also reworked a lot of the breach uniques. What they're trying to do here is they're trying to make the unupgraded version of breach uniques not be a weaker version of the item. They're trying to make it a standalone, separate item. A good example of this is Tullborn and Tullfall. Tullborn is now attempting to be a cold exposure wand, while Tullfall is now, instead of being a percent cold damage per frenzy charge wand, is now a flat cold damage to spells per power charge wand. They are trying to give a unique reason for you to want to have Tullborn and Tullfall in your build. With that, there's another really good example too. Hand of Thought, which is the weaker version of Hoa, is now attempting to be a deck stacking weapon rather than an in-stacking weapon. So you are going to be getting increased lightning damage with attacks per 10 dexterity. This is a completely new stat to the game. We have never had lightning damage scaling with dexterity. We've always had cold damage. While Hoa will still stay exactly what it is, a intelligence stacking lightning damage weapon. With this, we'll have 2 distinct playstyles, and this might give you some new build. On top of all this, there's some really massive buffs to some other ones. For example, Zoph's Heart, instead of it being ash when they hit you, is now nearby enemies are covered in ash. This makes Zoph's Heart insane, and it makes the ash consistent. It makes Zoph's Heart be another 10% or so more damage. Last example I want to give, Surrenderer, instead of giving 250 block on hits, can now roll up to 500 block on hit, making this the best life on block shield in the game. Let's move on to Abyss. Abyss is being changed a very interesting way. First, you are never going to get small abysses. Abysses will always go to 4 stops. With this, every time you get an abyssal depths, you will always find a lich. There will always be a lich. You can never spawn spires anymore. And now, instead, you have a chance to spawn spires when your abyss ends. This makes it so you can still acquire Stygians, and it'll be presumably about the same rate as before. They're also buffing all of the liches, making them actual proper endgame boss fights now. This should make them interesting and give you a reason to actually go down. And every time you see a depths, you'll be happy to know that you will get a massive reward at the end. They are also buffing all of the uniques from Abyss. Good example, Shroud the Lightless. instead of giving you a massive amount of bonus, it now gives you scaling bonus, right? Instead of 6 to 10% max life, you now gain 3% max life per Abyssal affecting you, while also potentially rolling with 2 and 3 socket variations, allowing you to have even more Abyssals. Tomb Fist is now getting the option to roll 2 modifiers out of a total pool of 6. We do not know what these other 4 are, but presumably they're very strong, so a well-rolled Tomb Fist might be a chase item now. Light Poacher is potentially coming back. What Light Poacher now does is it gives you a 5% physical damage as extra damage of each element per spirit charge. And you also have a 100% chance to get a spirit charge. This is a completely new stat, and this effectively is 15% physical damage as extra per spirit charge. This seems absolutely insane on Trinity builds and might become best in slot. Darkness Enthralled is being slightly nerfed, but can now roll to 100% instead of only being 75%. This might allow you for some unique interactions with belts. A good example of this is if you're running Storm Shroud and you have a 50% chance to avoid Shock Jewel, you can now put in Darkness Enthralled that is 100% rolled and fix your ailment immunity on a single Abyss Jewel instead of needing 2. The biggest winner of all this is Bubonic Trail. Bubonic Trail is being completely reworked into a reservation-based pair of boots if you have a unique jewel, up to 24% increased reservation efficiency if you have a unique Abyss Jewel. That means you can throw away one of your Abyss sockets in the Bubonic Trail to put on a unique Abyss Jewel, even if not very useful for you. Simply get a whole other aura in your build. These Abyss uniques should be game-changing, and we could potentially see some new builds propping up or some massive buffs to some builds before. In terms of Atlas changes, the biggest things I can tell you here is some of your favorite maps are going away, but some of your favorite maps are also coming back. Some examples include Mausoleum is being removed from the game, Mesa is being removed from the game. Sad times, but we can live without them. You're now getting maps such as Wharf, Tropical Island, Tower, Jungle Valley back, so it more than makes up for some of the losses that we have. Of course, they're also reshuffling div cards to make sense with all the map changes. It is what it is. The next thing we should talk about is the passive skill tree mastery changes. So they are reworking a very large portion of masteries, almost every single mastery in the game except totems and minions for some reason, which is kind of funny. They even showed minion masteries in the trailer, but there are no minion mastery changes. Every single other mastery type is getting reworked and some new masteries are being added to the game. The TLDR here is if a set of masteries did not have at least 6 options, everything has at least 6 options now. They have also added a large pool of potentially fun and unique different skills to these masteries. Unfortunately, I feel like they missed the mark here. A lot of these suck. A lot of your favorite masteries are now gone from the game. For example, elemental masteries. Your ability to take 15% elemental resistance, which was really good for early game, is now just completely gone. You cannot just get a free 15% elemental resistance until you fix your build. If you relied on the 40% increased effective ailments, that's also gone. We have some really not that useful effects in here. For example, if we want to look at the caster mastery, 25% chance to open nearby chests when you cast a spell. Vaults of Itsiri farming anyone? I guess. 25% more spell damage if you've been stunned while casting recently. I guess. Well, we also have some really big winners, such as gain adrenaline for 1 second when you change stance. I have a whole video dedicated to this if you want to know more about how this is completely broken and will completely change how you level every single build in the game. The overall opinion of the community and myself has been that these changes have missed the mark. A lot of builds are being nerfed, and it unfortunately sucks. In some of my builds, they've been nerfed by anywhere between 10 to 15% because I'm just losing masteries that I have no alternatives to. They are also changing and adding some clusters here and there. Some of these are pretty nice. Some of these are pretty big nerfs, and some of these are kind of whatever. One good example here is the Mark clusters. The Mark for Death cluster is losing a lot of its power and losing all of the damage on the small nodes leading up to it, while also losing the increased effective marks that is available on the mastery. This one, for example, massively nerfs marks in general and makes them a lot weaker. They're also just nerfing poisons. Some of the nodes that allowed you to hit 100% poison chance substantially easier have been reduced by half, and some of the duration nodes are also changed. Overall, we have some really good changes here, but a lot of these are kind of garbage and just feel like massive nerfs. Next up, we have 2 Ascendancy reworks. We have the Saboteur rework and we have the Pathfinder rework. Let's start by talking about Saboteur. So what they have done here is they have condensed the trap and the mine sections of the tree to collide on Pyromaniac. This is overall a little bit weaker than what we previously had for Saboteur, but it's not too much of a loss. The new nodes that they have added to the tree revolve around casts on crits or trigger builds in general. They're trying to turn Saboteur into a hybrid of mines, traps, and triggers. The biggest thing that people have been talking about is like clockwork, 30% increased cooldown recovery rate. This is going to allow for trigger builds to work better on Saboteur. And from my personal testing, if we want to look at Cast on Crit Ice Spear, this is not better than Occultist, but where this might shine is in super high budgets. You will be able to go Trickster, so you're substantially tankier than what Occultist offers, and you'll be able to Forbidden Flesh and Forbidden Flame like clockwork, and this will give you your pair of boots back, with powerful boots like Bubonic Trail being added, where we can get a lot of reservation to fit an extra aura into our build. Flesh and Flaming this to not need any CDR on your belt or your boots with a Awakened Cast on Crit might be really powerful. But in terms of playing Saboteur Trigger, you really will not want to do this. You'll want to play the other possible choices. You're also going to get Perfect Crime. This is going to give you level 20 trigger bots, which is completely different than skitter bots. You presumably will be able to have these and skitter bots out. What trigger bots will do is they will cast your triggers for you. So for example, if I'm playing Cast on Crit Ice Spear, my Ice Spears are going to be triggered from both of my trigger bots. This effectively doubles the damage of my Ice Spear, but it comes with a 35% less damage on it. When you do the math on this, Perfect Crime is worth 30% more damage for triggered skills. This might make Cast on Crit Assassin and Cast on Crit Trickster very popular, where you might not pick up like clockwork if you want to make up for the cooldown recovery rate on your own. You might instead pick up Perfect Crime for just 30% more damage. Lastly, Born in the Shadows is completely the same. They've added a new node, Bomb Specialist, which gives you a chance to do more area damage and a chance to take less area damage. It's a defensive node, but it's not very good. Moving on to Pathfinder. So with Pathfinder, they have reworked it to make it more nice to be used as a chaos ascendancy in general, rather than it specifically being good for chaos attack. The biggest one here is Nature's Reprisal. Instead of it being specifically around chaos attack skills, it just now gives you Wither, and it gives you increased Wither effect. So this is good for any chaos build, which is very nice. They have also reworked Master Surgeon to allow you to basically have a permanent life flask, but it does have a massive recovery loss on it. They have added all of the increased effect back to Nature's Boon. They have consolidated some of the effects around the ascendancy and put it on here, which is a pretty nice change. Master Alchemist has been massively buffed. It is now all ailment effects, and it's 50% chance for Refast not to consume charges versus 20%. This should make it that having permanent flasks will be a little bit easier than before. Lastly, the last point I want to talk about is Master Distiller. Picking this node will eventually kind of turn all of your skills into Poisonous Concoction, where every time you use the skills, it will take charges from a variety of flasks to give you massive buffs. So for example, if it uses a Diamond Flask charge, you'll get 150% increased critical strike chance. Mind you, you can still have your Diamond Flask active, so you can get just a hell of a lot more critical strike chance. Or Bismuth Flask penetration. Think of this with Wise Oak. This is going to be a really strong combo, or Amethyst for a lot of extra chaos damage. Overall, this Ascendancy change is looking pretty interesting and should be pretty strong. With all this, the Ascendant versions of Pathfinder and Saboteur are being changed. The Saboteur Ascendant isn't going to be very strong. It's losing the penetration, it's losing the regeneration. So if you're playing a Mom Mind build Ascendant, this is going to suck, but it's gaining CDR and chance to deal more area damage, which don't really make up for it. This overall is something you're not going to be picking anymore. The Pathfinder node did lose the Removes Bleeding, which doesn't really matter, but they have made the chance to consume flasks go from 15% to 25%, which is a big buff for Word Loop. There has been a little bit of a skill balance, and the community is mostly negative about this. Melee Splash was buffed slightly by 1%. Not much of a change really to talk about there. Blight has also been buffed slightly. I don't think this is going to be good enough to be used as a leveling skill. Explosive Trap has also been nerfed early game, but has not been touched late game. This is just to make it a little bit weaker for leveling. Shattering Steel and Splitting Steel have absolutely been gutted as leveling skills. If you're someone who used Splitting Steel to get to level 12, fortunately, it's not going to really be good anymore. You'll still be able to do it, but it's going to not feel very good. A change which I think a lot of people are pretty upset about is the spark change. So they are reducing it by 1 projectile. Again, it's completely fine at max level, so it's only going to be an early game change. But the parts which people are confused about is this: the base projectile speed of spark has been reduced. They haven't said by what amount. Now, obviously we don't know the exact speed in units per second, but they could tell us the relative change. If spark is by default 50% slower now, spark is completely unusable. If it's 25% slower, I would say that's a pretty decent nerf, but spark is still good. If it's a 10% base projectile speed nerf, then that's kind of a slap on the wrist, and this doesn't really change anything. But the fact that they haven't said any sort of relative percent here makes this really hard to judge. This makes it, if you want to use spark as a leveling skill, or if you wanted to go into spark as your build for the season, a massive pile of unknown. Spark could be so nerfed that this is completely unusable. And if we look at what they did to Shattering and Splitting Steel, this skill could be completely gutted for all we know. We just simply have no idea. And if you want to play this, you are basically taking a risk. They have also slightly buffed buffed Spectral Throw, which is kind of nice. They have massively buffed Lightning Tendrils. So if Spark is not good anymore for leveling, Lightning Tendrils is going to be insane. They have increased the early damage by about 30% or so. And the same goes for late game damage. They have increased the effectiveness from 100 to 130. And they have made the strong pulls no longer deal 200% more damage, but always crit now, which is effectively the same thing. And it makes the strong pulls happen every 3 pulls instead of 4. Lightning Tendrils looks like an absolute monster and potentially a complete replacement for Spark, at least to get you to level 12 if you previously used Spark to get to level 12, or to Act 3 or to Act 4, or whatever the case was. And unfortunately, you know how we had Spectral Helix be completely removed from the game? Unfortunately, Poisonous Concoction has also been removed from the game. This is not necessarily a full nerf. The change here is instead of it consuming 2 charges per attack, it is now 1 charge per projectile. So this is trying to curve Poisonous Concoction, stacking a lot of increased projectiles like it used to, and to do massively shotgunned poison hits. This isn't that bad. You can simply remove some of your projectiles and take some damage supports instead. And for leveling, this is not the worst thing ever. Let's think about leveling for a second. How do you level? Well, you don't really have a lot of utility flasks. Sure, you'll get them as you level, but more often than not, you'll be leveling with 2, maybe 3 life flasks. So all this really does is it just incentivizes you to run 2 or 3 life flasks. And if you are someone who used Poisonous Concoction to, for example, go from Act 1 to Act 4 before you can play your skill, or you need to use Poisonous Concoction to maps and then you re-rolled into your build at maps, this will do just fine for that. This is a really big nerf for maps, since for maps, you can't really use 2 or 3 life flasks to make up for all of the charges it's going to use. Sure, they buffed it slightly to make up for this. That's honestly, in my opinion, not enough. When you need 4 utility flasks, 1 life flask is simply just not enough to keep up with the charge demand. So Poisonous Concoction is still going to be a really good skill to get you to your breakpoints for your build, or it's going to be a good skill to get you to maps. As soon as you get to maps and you want to use utility flasks, you have to reroll. A change a lot of people also don't like, Onslaught, is completely being removed from the game because they want to shake up the speedrunner meta. A lot of what we're about to go over next is to, in their own words, shake up the speedrunning meta. For apparently a lot of this will not apply to casual players, and a lot of this won't really affect us because we get a lot of buffs. It's only going to be really for speedrunners, but I can tell you speedrunners are not happy about this, and the general populace really isn't happy about all these changes either. It's overall nerf for everyone, and just going to make what we already have known and experienced while leveling be completely different. For some reason, they are really target focusing, nerfing your leveling experience this season. They're making it worse, which is very strange. The Onslaught has been completely removed. As we mentioned, the support gems earlier are there to be a replacement for them, and we're getting a new support called Momentum, which effectively is going to do the same thing except for the movement speed. They are also changing some skills to make it a little bit easier to level. Faster attacks is now available at level 8. Sniper's Mark, Warlord's Mark, and Poacher's Marks are also available slightly earlier. The biggest change here is Sniper's Mark. Instead of having to wait until the end of Act 3, you can now get Sniper's Mark after doing mudflats. For example, if you're going to level with Spark, this is a pretty big change. This kind of makes up for some of the nerfs of Spark. And if you just wanted Sniper's Mark in your build in general, you can now get it much early on. So if you weren't using something that got nerfed or changed, this is just a massive buff for you. It should make Act 1 and Act 2 substantially easier. This is a really big speedrunner nerf. All scepters have had their base attack speed massively reduced. The meta in general, not just for speedrunners, but if you want to level very fast, was to use 2 mobility skills, which was Leap Slam and Frost Blink together, as they didn't share cooldowns. You would do a Leap Slam and then Frost Blink at the end of the animation. Because of that, you needed a scepter, and well, they have nerfed scepters to not be as strong. This kind of kills Leap Slam Frost Blinking, and there's no real alternative to it. At least I personally don't really know of an alternative. I don't really look into speedrunning that much, but I think from TaiTai's perspective, it's just completely dead. Now, here's a change that everyone hates. They didn't want vendor recipe systems to exist anymore, so they have completely removed the wand vendor recipe systems. To make up for this, they have changed some of the base types on wands to give added damage for both fire, cold, and lightning instead of spell damage. But not only are these numbers weaker than the amounts that you were able to get previously, but you are now losing the spell damage implicit. So while yes, you do not have to do the vendor recipe system anymore, which I guess is a buff, your overall, if you were doing the vendor recipe system before, substantially weaker since you're losing out on a massive amount of spell damage. You are now inclined to upgrade your wands, but the problem with this is, let's say I'm playing a lightning spell build. Well, then I can only get spiraled wands, I can only get coiled wands, and I can only get tornado wands as my viable wand upgrades. Before, there was a very nice curve of wands that I would get, and I would just keep putting the stats I wanted on them. Now I can only benefit from 1 in every 4 base types. They're keeping some base types as just spell damage, which is meant to be for chaos skills, but again, you cannot put flat damage on them, so they are basically just as weak. They're also reworking Arcane Surge. Arcane Surge is now not a global more spell damage increase. So gone are the days of putting Flame Dash and level 1 Arcane Surge together, a permanent Arcane Surge. You now are going to want to actually use it. They are trying to make Arcane Surge the onslaught of spellcasting casters, where it's going to also give you a lot of increased cast speed. So Arcane Surge might actually be worth using, but if you wanted to use it in a build otherwise, it's just a 10% nerf. They said that they didn't want to nerf too many builds this season, but a nerf like this effectively basically nerfs 90% of spells in the game by 10%, which is kind of sad. To make up for this for Hierophant, which was, a heavily Arcane Surge based ascendancy, they're reworking Hierophant, and overall Hierophant is actually a little bit stronger. When you look at all the numbers, Hierophant with Arcane Surge is substantially better than it was before. Here's a change that I don't think any of us are going to be happy about. Molten Shell has been nerfed by 50%. This is to bring it in line with all other defensive skills. It is now just 50% weaker. It can, instead of 10,000 total shield, only do 5,000 total shield. For Vol Molten Shell instead, it is now, instead of 30,000, 10,000, which is substantially weaker. The scaling is still the same. You're still going to need 50,000 armor to benefit from Molten Shell at its peak, but the total that you're going to get is a lot weaker. I don't think anyone likes this change. It's just overall makes most builds squishier, as most builds use Molten Shell. And they have not buffed or changed the other defensive skills to compensate. Every defensive skill is just overall weaker. They have slightly changed animated weapons to make them a little bit better. This is basically a clunkiness change, and now they should feel a little bit better to play. They have changed a few projectiles and how they interact with return. The TLDR of this is Nimbus Fireball cast on crit has been massively nerfed. Your fireballs, as soon as they start returning to you, if they hit something, they just explode and go away. They will not go through multiple enemies. And the same goes for just Nimbus Fireball in general. It is now substantially weaker, since your fireballs will not pierce through everything and still explode. There are some other changes in here as well. One of these, if I'm not mistaken, basically means that Nimbus Creeping Frost will not work anymore, as soon as it reaches its full destination, it explodes. It will not make a new projectile to return to you. But overall, they are trying to simplify returning behaviors so they are all effectively the same and not have weird outliers and weird cases. They have massively nerfed Vol Smite for some reason. All strike skills that are Vol'd cannot be supported by Ancestral Call, so your Vol Smite does not benefit from Ancestral Call anymore, which makes it substantially weaker for clearing. Power charges have been buffed from 40% to 50% crit chance, which is a pretty nice change. Lets you hit your crit cap a little bit easier if you're a power charge stacker. And last but not least, Withering Step can now be supported by Spell Totem, which means your spell totems have feet, ? That is all about it for changes. The last thing I want to quickly mention in terms of crafting, bow attacks fire additional arrow as a synth implicit cannot be rolled on bows and quivers, but to compensate for this, they have added +2 projectiles to the passive tree, which overall I think is a little bit better. Making insane synth items is now going to be easier, and you have a free synth implicit. They don't have to go for plus arrow. And for builds that weren't able to run bows or equip quivers, you can now also potentially either anoint or just simply pick up additional projectiles from the passive tree, which is pretty massive in some cases. Last but not least, Infinite Heist is completely destroyed. One, they have changed it so vendors do not immediately reroll on level up. They cannot go back to Heist every level while you're leveling and buy new contracts. You'll only be able to do that every few levels. So if you're just simply doing heisting as a strategy right before you go into maps, that is going to be a lot weaker. And books of regression are gone. So if you want to do infinite heisting, that is also completely removed from the game. I don't really agree with this change. I don't think infinite heisting was very broken. It just allowed some specific strategies to work better than others. Where you had a weak build that was pretty bad without gear, but was decent enough to do heist. This allowed you to be able to do infinite heist to make all your money to be able to play your builds or get your build enabling item. You cannot do that anymore, which kind of fucks a lot of people over. And Katarina, unique item drop chances for Katarina have been rebalanced. So there's two ways you can take this. One, Diadem is substantially rare now, so you cannot farm Diadem in Foothills anymore. And because you cannot do books of regression anymore, you cannot keep regressing yourself to keep farming them. Or the other way to take this is by item drop chances have been rebalanced. That could mean a reshuffling of things. Personally, what I think this change means is Kane of Kolamak and Devouring Diadem have swapped places. So Devouring Diadem is now a level 83 Katarina only drop, and Kane can now be gotten instead of a Devouring Diadem. Kane, in my opinion, is not a very strong item unless it's rolled insanely well, which is kind of difficult to do. So it's fair that it's a little bit more common as you need more Canes to get a good Cane, while I think we can all agree Diadem is overpowered. Yes, it sucks, but I think we can all agree this is a fair change. I would prefer this over them nerfing Diadem overall. So if you're planning on using Diadem in an early game character, you now have to rethink about that. It's going to be a lot rarer and a lot more expensive. Last but not least, let's talk about Kirak mods. So the big winners here is we get Essence back at 3 essences instead of 2, and we get strong boxes back at 4 strong boxes. This is going to be a good season for mapping. I will be giving my thoughts on this in a separate video on some moneymakers for the next season. Some other ones you might be interested in is Smuggler Caches, which is kind of nice, and Sacred Grove. This will be good if Harvest Sextants go over 12 chaos per map. You might want to then potentially use this, and this caps Harvest Sextants at never going over 12 chaos per use per map. That is about it for changes. Overall, quite a lot of nerfs when they said they weren't going to nerf things, which is a little bit unfortunate. But I think with all the mastery changes and with all the new items, especially all the Crucible items, I think we're going to have a really interesting season with a lot of interesting builds. I think the Crucible weapons on their own are going to prop up weaker builds to be either really fun to play and really strong, or just straight up make them meta defining. While it's easy enough to look at this patch through a negative lens through all the nerfs when they said they weren't going to nerf much, I feel like all of the unique item changes are in a very good direction. All the breach and all the abyss items are now insane and potentially build defining, and the Crucible items, well, are going to be quite insane. Overall, if you enjoyed playing your builds last season, they should basically be just as good this season in most cases. That's all I really have to say for the patch notes. If you appreciate this or if you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments. I also stream on Twitch every day. You can come by there and ask me any questions you have there, or if you want any of my opinions on everything or anything, feel free to come by. If not, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and I'll see you guys in the next video.